Hi there, welcome. This is the Kelly's Astrology podcast, where you can find insight, guidance, and understanding through astrology. I'm Kelly, and I'll be your host. Hey there, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Kelly's Astrology podcast. This week, I want to talk about Mars retrograde. On Friday, December 5th, Mars will go retrograde at 6 Leo. So that's what I want to focus on in today's show. I did want to acknowledge that you might have noticed I missed last week's show. I missed doing an episode last week. The Mercury retrograde just got to me. There is so much chaotic Mercury energy out there right now, and I just wasn't able to get an episode ready in time. For me personally, this time of year is my busiest time with teaching, where I have a variety of courses and webinars and trainings around the astrology of the year ahead. That's what I tend to be spending a lot of time on at this time of the year. Plus, of course, heading into the holiday season. And so I am not exactly sure what the podcast schedule will look like over the next few weeks. I hope to keep offering you a show most weeks, but I have a feeling that there will be 1 or 2 weeks where I do miss an episode. I will try and let you know in advance, but I wanted to just mention it here in case that happens again. You know, with Mercury being in detriment and retrograde and square Saturn, there's so much going on with Mercury right now. And for me personally, I'm in a monthly profection that is ruled by Mercury. So I'm definitely feeling all of those different features of Mercury being a little bit pulled in many directions. So something had to give last week, and unfortunately, it was the podcast. It was so fun for me to spend time with students. I've got my mentoring group going and my year ahead planning group of students, and we have been having a blast. But to focus on them, I wasn't able to be here with you all. So a lot of Mercury retrograde discussion already, which is probably par for the course right now. But let's take a look at another planet, Mars, even though we will still be talking about a retrograde. So Mars is going to be retrograde from December 6th through to February 23rd. Quite a long time. Mars retrograde are longer than Mercury retrograde and then Venus retrograde. So you can expect the next few months until late February to have that kind of stalled or slower, maybe even a bit of a congested feel, sluggish maybe. And that you'll be noticing especially around the topics of the Leo part of your chart and of the Cancer part of your chart. Before we get any further into Mars retrograde, I want to mention that my next live webinar is happening on January 4th. It is all about the transits and astrology trends for 2025, like a 90-minute overview of the astrological things you need to know for the year ahead. I'll be sharing all about the major astrology of 2025. And so if you'd like insight into what 2025 might have in store, I hope you can join us for my webinar on January 4th. For details or to sign up, pop over to kellysastrology.com. Okay, so back to Mars retrograde. Mars will spend part of its retrograde in Leo and part of its retrograde in Cancer. The first part of Mars retrograde is the part that's in Leo, and that will start on December 6th and run until January 6th. On January 6th, Mars is still retrograde, but now it reverses back into Cancer. So the second part of Mars retrograde is when Mars is in Cancer, and that starts January 6th and runs until the end of the retrograde on February 23rd. So even though the Mars retrograde will start in Leo, Mars will actually spend more time going backwards in Cancer. So first off, let's cover off some of the general themes of Mars retrograde. Keep in mind that while Mars retrograde is a part of the astro weather for the next 3 months, it may or may not have a big impact on you personally. It's certainly a clue that 2025 is going to start under this kind of going backwards before going forwards vibe. Usually a Mars retrograde is going to be especially significant for you if Mars is your time lord right now, either your annual or monthly time lord. If the sign that the Mars retrograde is happening in happens to be your profected sign or house for the year, Or a Mars retrograde can also be important for you if you have lots of planets in Aries or Scorpio, which are the signs ruled by Mars. Now, if that's not you, if any of those criteria don't apply to you, it's likely that there will be other more important astro factors in your birth chart than the Mars retrograde. So it's good to understand what's going on. It's also to understand how relevant it is for you or not. I mean, that said, I know many of you do like to understand the general astro weather, and it is a great idea to keep an eye on these retrogrades, especially of planets like Mars or Venus, where they're retrograde less frequently than all the other planets. For instance, we only have a Mars retrograde once every 2 years, and I do find that a Mars retrograde can be a helpful time to pause, to kind of consciously disengage from the pushing and rushing of modern life, and instead to think about going deeper around certain topics or certain parts of life. Now, Mars is generally associated with assertiveness, with anger, with drive, and with courage. So you might be reviewing how you assert yourself or how you express your needs and wants while Mars is retrograde. These are great constructive things to do to work with Mars retrograde. You might be rethinking or reviewing how to manage your anger. You might be learning new clues about how to recognize when you're getting angry or when you're getting frustrated. It might be that during the course of the Mars retrograde, you're gaining new insights into navigating disagreements or managing tension that arises, kind of in a normal way as part of everyday life. Since Mars does like to move, to push, to power forward, to keep up a steady pace, Mars retrograde can be a time where the pace of progress does slow down. Now, you might find that you're dealing with extra delays or detours or distractions, or you're waiting on other people and you can't go without their input or without their contribution. So understanding that change of pace can be really helpful to working with Mars retrograde. While Mars is retrograde, you might get sidetracked away from your main project or priority, or you might find there's a new passion that temporarily captures your attention for a little while. Certainly taking the least direct route is likely. So the more circular route is possible when Mars is retrograde. You can further personalize the influence of Mars retrograde by noting the topics of the house in your chart that has Leo or Cancer on the cusp. These will be the areas of your personal chart, your life, that are going to be activated by the Mars retrograde. And so you might personally encounter and work with Mars retrograde around the people and topics associated with the Cancer and the Leo part of your chart. I know it's really common to think about Mars retrograde as some kind of bad thing, but personally, I think it can be a really constructive cycle. When I think back on the last few Mars retrogrades and how they've shown up for me in my chart and my life, I can actually see that the period of Mars retrograde was a time of really intensive, concentrated, almost all-consuming effort towards a very specific goal. So it was a really particular focus with intensive effort. And instead of moving quickly while Mars was retrograde, I was actually like pausing and going deeper to get further into things, to figure them out, and to make more radical overhauls of whatever those things were. One personal experience is from a few years ago now, when Mars went retrograde inside my 4th house in my birth chart. And during this time, we underwent a substantial renovation project on our home. It's kind of classic. Mars was retrograde in the 4th house, and we did a renovation. Almost the entire time of that extended Mars transit in my 4th house, remembering that the retrograde is there for about 3 months, but it could be a good couple of months before and after the retrograde that Mars is in that one part of your chart. That time basically correlated with the renovation. And I was really struck by the Mars themes, at the start of the renovation, which was at the start of Mars coming into that 4th house of my chart. A bunch of tradespeople, many of whom were young men, showed up with tools and implements and sharp and noisy things to first do a little bit of a demo and then to rebuild a part of our home. And it was all the things that you would expect. It was intense, it was loud, it was busy, it was noisy. And of course, as is par for the course with building and renovation projects, there were some snafus and issues along the way. We were able to deal with them and keep going. And it really did feel like our home life was taken over by this very Marsy experience around that whole time, including the Mars retrograde in the fourth house. And then before we knew it, it was over. Mars left that part of my chart, the retrograde was done, and all of a sudden, a part of our home had been completely reworked and updated, totally improved in a profoundly kind of intense and permanent way. And I share that story because it clues us in to a few ways of understanding Mars retrograde, which helps us work with it. So instead of thinking of a Mars retrograde as a time not to do things, think about how Mars retrograde might invite this concentrated effort. So one of my favorite words for Mars retrograde is this sort of concentration or intensity, like intense effort and energy expended towards a particular goal or problem. So Mars usually only spends about 6 weeks in each house in your chart every 2 years. So just 6 weeks every 2 years is all you get for Mars. But when Mars goes retrograde, that 6 weeks can extend up to 6 months. And that's where that concentration or intensive quality of energy comes from. You get this extra long influence of Mars while it's retrograde, just before and just after the whole period, around a particular area of your life. And that only happens if Mars will be retrograde in that part of your chart and life. And what that Mars retrograde can do is it can encourage you to pull that part of your life apart and then put it back together in a totally new and hopefully much better way. So if you think about my experience of Mars retrograde in the fourth house, of pulling apart literally a section of our home and then putting it back together, updating essential things like heating and plumbing, but also adding some nice to have components in there as well, you're going to do something similar around the Cancer and Leo parts of your chart and life over this next couple of months as Mars undertakes its retrograde, which maybe you now think of as a bit of a renovation to this part of your chart and life. The other thing with the Mars retrograde that's important to keep in mind is that unlike the retrogrades of Mercury and Venus, those retrogrades happen on a regular pattern and they predictably return to the same group of zodiac signs. Whereas a Mars retrograde is a more irregular type of event. We know that it happens every 2 years, but where in the zodiac it happens, there's no pattern, there's no rhyme or reason to that. And so there's no guarantee that Mars will be back retrograde in the same part of the zodiac or of your chart anytime soon. It makes a Mars retrograde a little bit more of a unique, potentially one-off type event. Like, for instance, every 8 years, we have a Venus retrograde coming back to the same sign and house in our chart. But over the course of our lifetime, we might only have 2 or 3 Mars retrogrades in any given part of our chart. So in some ways, you could think about a Mars retrograde as a really special cycle to grab and use when you have it, as the intensity and the effort that it offers, as well as that kind of, compulsion or that driving energy to engage with more complex problems or situations. That energy might not come around anytime soon. We certainly don't plan to renovate our home again anytime soon. It was something that was a huge undertaking to think about, but that kind of one-off, special, unique, we did it, we're glad it's all been done. Of course, there were extra things we had to do once we got into it, but that's kind of the Mars retrograde or the Mars renovation, if you like, of a part of your chart. You're not going to do this again. You're not going to pull things apart in this way. Maybe you won't be so bold or outspoken in an ongoing forever way, but there may be something that you really need to tackle that's challenging and that's complex, and it's going to take a lot of your focus and energy, and it's worth doing that under a Mars retrograde. One special feature that I wanted to mention of this Mars retrograde, there's so many extra features about this Mars retrograde. I have a feeling I'll do a second follow-up episode on Mars retrograde maybe in January. So for now, let's talk about the aspect that Mars will make as part of its retrograde. And that is an opposition to Pluto. So here's a little tip to keep in mind that if we've got a quick planet like Mercury, Venus, or Mars going retrograde, and while they retrograde, they aspect one of our slower moving planets like Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto. Typically, that aspect is the middle aspect in a sequence of three aspects between that quick moving planet, in this case Mars, and the slow moving planet, in this case Pluto. So Mars is going to oppose Pluto 3 times, once before, once during, and once after the retrograde. So this whole extended cycle of Mars to do with its retrograde is tied in to opposition to Pluto kind of themes. So let me give you the dates and degrees and details of the Mars-Pluto oppositions, and then we'll talk a little bit about what it means. So the first Mars opposite Pluto aspect has already happened. It was November 3rd, 2024. Mars was at 29 Cancer and Pluto was at 29 Capricorn. The next two Mars opposite Pluto aspects have not happened yet. We've got one coming up on January 3rd, 2025. Mars will be at 1 Leo, Pluto at 1 Aquarius. And the third and final Mars-Pluto aspect in the sequence is April 26th. Mars will be at 3 Leo and Pluto will be at 3 Aquarius. You might notice that 2 of these 3 Mars opposite Pluto aspects will happen across the Leo and Aquarius axis. We've got that one in early January while Mars is retrograde, and then one in late April once Mars is direct again. So Mars opposing Pluto creates or brings forward power dynamics. It highlights control themes. And what that means is this particular Mars retrograde has a lot to do with changing alliances or allegiances, as well as rebalancing, changing, updating, refreshing power dynamics. That can apply at work, in your romantic life, with friends or family, around your finances, around your fitness. It can apply anywhere in your life. Look at the house that Mars in Leo will be in and the house that Pluto in Aquarius will be in. And that's the 2 areas of your life that you're in a little bit of a struggle or kind of a like, who is really going to take precedence or priority here kind of dynamic. Another piece I've thought about with Mars in Leo opposing Pluto in Aquarius is that because Pluto is still settling into its new sign, this feels like the emergence of new power dynamics, new clashes or new disagreements for this new era of Pluto in Aquarius. At a personal level, you might find yourself aggravated about topics that never bothered you before. You might notice that you're getting into different kinds of disagreements or that you want to take charge around an area of life that you've previously left to others to control or manage. That's what I mean by new power dynamics, new control themes for the new era. We've not had Mars in Leo opposing Pluto in Aquarius before. And so even though we know what Mars-Pluto oppositions feel like, they're coming through in zodiac signs and parts of our chart and lives that are new for all of us. Now, Mars opposite Pluto can certainly be a bit of a volatile aspect, a combative aspect, especially collectively. I do think, though, at a personal level, this Mars opposite Pluto aspect can be very revealing in terms of helping you understand the power you have and how you really want to use it. Sure, it may be that you're becoming aware of power dynamics or disagreements or qualities of frustration that you weren't aware of before. Pay attention to that. That's something that you can work with. You can start to empower yourself around. We're going to have a long time, 20 years, of figuring out Mars in Leo, Pluto in Aquarius power dynamics. But what we get a taste of in early 2025 kind of gives us those insights about what to focus on going forward. So that is Mars retrograde in a nutshell. Mars will be retrograde in Leo, then in Cancer. Mars will be retrograde for about 10 or 11 weeks until late February. And we're going to be working through new kinds of power dynamics thanks to that Mars opposite Pluto aspect. There's a lot more, of course, that could be said about Mars retrograde, but I wanted to give you this kind of bird's eye view so you've got a sense of what's going on as Mars begins its retrograde this week, and also some things to keep in mind with managing yourself, your expectations, and your focus over the coming 3 months. Let me know what houses in your chart this Mars retrograde will activate. I hope these tips have given you a few different ways of understanding the Mars retrograde cycle and maybe a little bit of inspiration about what or where you might want to renovate in your life as inspired by this Mars retrograde. We do have Mars retrograde with us until late February of 2025. So keep that in mind. You've got lots of time to work with it. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode of the Kelly's Astrology podcast. I look forward to sharing another episode again soon. Until then, take care.